influence, whether in the context of North-South dialogue or intercontinental exchanges. Consequently, countries of the Global South are confronted with new opportunities and challenges as they address their own priorities, presenting a crucial opening to assert their newfound position for a more inclusive and balanced equilibrium. How can the Global South actively shape and influence international geopolitical dynamics to ensure representation and address imbalances in the global decision-making process? In the face of global challenges, how might the Global South enhance its collective influence through strategic alliances in order to address global issues like climate change or economic inequality? What type of intercontinental framework could effectively showcase
Please welcome to the stage the moderator for the opening conversation, founder of Udwa Kamimo, coaching and consulting, Udwa Kamimo.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. It's my pleasure to be with you. I see familiar faces, Laundry, Ade, various others. It's my pleasure to moderate this conversation with my distinguished panelists and our elder statesmen representing Africa and Latin America. I'll invite them to join me on stage, starting with the former president. I'll carry on with the theme of progressive lenses. Starting with the former president of Ecuador, Luis Osvaldo Hurtado Laria. His eminence straddles politics, law, and academia. President, yes, he's coming. And my second guest is the former president of Nigeria, Olusegun Obasanjo, who's also the current African Union High Envoy for the Horn of Africa. This is fine. Thank you. Excellencies, welcome. I'll start with you in the audience because it feels like wherever you look, we have feedback coming from somewhere. I'm not sure where. Okay. I'll start with an audience question. So if you could take out your phones and go to the interactivity section of it. I have a question for you, word cloud, because wherever you turn, it looks like there's trouble. And Kareem made that point eloquently. We're balancing between the cold rationality of the head and the emotionality of the heart. Yes, Debussy, I see you wondering about that. And so my question to you is, what should a new Atlantic deal that reflects a more assertive global South include? Debt forgiveness, pragmatism, the question, if you see there, equality, equity, and pragmatism. And so, Excellency President Obasanjo, I'll start with you because I've asked the audience for their thoughts on our topic. And very big on their minds is what equity and pragmatism looks like in a new Atlantic deal. Given your experience, what would you say Atlantic cooperation should look like?
Thank you very much. Let me start by commending the organizers of Atlantic Dialogues for the last 11 years. And particularly, let me appreciate my brother Karim, who has been at the center and at the head of this program for as long as it has been successfully led. Let me talk a little bit about the overall or overhanging title or topic, a more assertive Atlantic, its meaning for the world. My understanding of assertiveness is that you have some power, some influence to be effectively able to assert your influence, your power, your authority. And to be able to do that, you need certain amount of strength, be it political, be it economic, be it military, or other form of strength that will make you to be effectively influential or assertive. And if we look at this in the context of the South Atlantic, how much power do we have individually? How much influence do we have individually? I don't believe we have much. Therefore, if we are acting in silos, we aren't going to get far if we get anywhere at all. So it brings me to the point you have asked me to comment on. And they talk of equity. How much equity is there in the world? And how much equity has ever been there in the world? Let us take the Atlantic we are talking about. For 600 years, it has been exploitation of South Atlantic by Europe for the interest of Europe. That cannot be equity. 400 years of slave trade, human beings as commodity, shipped through the Atlantic, over the Atlantic, to the New World of the Caribbeans and Latin America for tobacco and sugarcane plantation to enrich Europe. At that time, there was virtually no city in Europe that did not get benefit from the New World out of slave trade, human beings as commodity, to the New World for sugarcane and tobacco plantation. That was taken over by colonialism after the abolition. And colonialism was exploitation of Africa and Latin America to enrich Europe. And there's virtually no country that did not get the benefit of colonialism directly or indirectly. So if we are talking of a new deal and a new situation in the South Atlantic, it must take into account what we did not have in the past. We did not have the togetherness, the cooperation that was necessary for us to be able to ward off those things that militated against us and that worked against our interest. So the first thing I would say, for us to get equity, for us to get what is due to us, for us to get a South Atlantic that will be able to be of benefit to itself and to the world at large, is for us to have cooperation, togetherness. We in Africa, we have a saying that if you want to walk and go fast, you should go alone. But if you want to go far, you should go together. I believe that in South Atlantic now, we need to go fast to catch up. And we also need to go far to make sure that we do not lag behind.
Sir, I'll interrupt you there so that President Osvaldo can take us into going far and fast, because you've given us a fairly accurate portrayal of the historical events that brought us to where we are at this point. And so from your perspective, President Osvaldo, whether we see on the African continent, the African Union becoming a permanent member of the G20, or the BRICS expansion, or the recent IMF World Bank spring meetings here in Marrakesh in October, this conversation is taking place amid increasing visibility and options for the global South, even though President Obasanjo says we don't necessarily have the strength. So what would a new Atlantic deal need to take into account? From the audience, we heard pragmatism, we heard reality, and President Obasanjo seems to be making the case for debt forgiveness as well. From your perspective, from Latin America, what would you add to that mix?
Bueno, a mí me parece que uno de los fenómenos económicos, políticos y sociales más importantes del siglo XXI es la notable emergencia que ha conseguido África en estos órdenes.
I would say that Latin America hasn't been registering the same growth as Africa. The economic growth of the African countries has been of around 5%. Only China, with a more than 10% over the last 50 years, has overgrown Africa in this very significant result. This has been followed by a significant improvement in the living conditions of the African peoples. Life expectancy has literally doubled. There has been a significant reduction in poverty. The middle class is now on the rise. I'm saying all of this because I would like to say that Africa has become an international partner, not only in the Atlantic area, but also worldwide, with a much stronger voice than that in the 20th century. That is not the case for Latin America, a continent that was quite ahead, that had been quite ahead for many years, actually, in the 19th century. The Latin American economy in the 21st century has grown in approximately half the percentage of the GDP growth in Africa. However, Latin America does have some edge over, illiteracy has been basically non-existent nowadays. Every child that wants to go to school can do it. Life expectancy is of around 70 years old, very close to the life expectancy for developed societies. Despite these social milestones, and because of its relative economic stagnation, Latin America has lost some of its power as an actor. And I don't see in the middle term any chance for this stagnation that affects Latin America to be reverted, in a sense that we can again register significant growth similar to what we are seeing now in Africa. In my opinion, whereas I believe that South-South relationships do matter and are important, the progress of our societies is determined by the interest that might trigger the African economy and the Latin America economy in the world. It is not, we cannot actually conceive the Mexican economic power without considering that Mexico has a joint border to the US. And in the same line, it is not possible to conceive such power and progress erasing these strong relationships to Europe. A new element to the mix is that China has become an essential component in African and Latin American countries. For some of these countries, China is the main export destination, and this is already happening today. What I would like to say is that when these trends will consolidate in the future in Africa and Latin America, South-to-South relationships and relationships within the Atlantic area will become stronger and at a faster pace than in the past.
Thank you, sir. If you read the current edition of the Atlantic Dialogue's magazine, Currents, the first article by, I believe it's Paul Isbell, talks about the Atlantic Basin being the only oceanic region without a formal association, that the other regions, the Indo-Pacific and various others, have formal associations, but the Atlantic Basin has, documents, initiatives, and various, instruments. So, President Obasanjo, I'll come to you. You started making the point when I interrupted you, what this New Deal should look like. And this researcher seems to be arguing that we need, in the Atlantic Basin, a formal association. But we're hearing, at least I'm hearing from President Osvaldo, I don't know about the rest of you, I'm hearing some degree of perhaps skepticism, maybe caution, maybe the pragmatism that you in the audience were talking about, given the configuration of the world at present. So if we are constructing Southern cooperation without the mediation of the traditional interests in the global north or Western countries, what would that look like?
Thank you very much. Well, one of the things that we all agree at this moment is that we have moved away a long time ago from bipolar world to a unipolar world, and the unipolar world is now being shattered. We are not sure of what will finally replace it. We are in transition. But then what that makes is that we have trouble everywhere. We have instability. And what is good for the world?
Sorry,
The
let me
world.
just, are we okay?
Yeah.
Are you okay now? Okay, great, thank you.
Okay.
It's fine, continue, sir.
All right.
Thank you.
What is good for the world? And for me, I believe we need an organization which should not call it South Atlantic Organization, because we should make room for those who want to join, who may not be in the South. So let us call it an Atlantic Cooperation Organization. But it will be started from Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean. This will be an organization for peace, for security, and for development. Anybody who wants to join in can join in later. And I believe such an organization will augur well for Africa, the whole of Africa, for Latin America, and the Caribbean. And I believe that AU, probably through the instrumentality of the government of Morocco, can spearhead this through AU. And a country like Brazil can stay ahead on the Latin American side. And we can have a new organization that is not for military, but for peace, for security, for development, and for moving the global south forward. And we are not looking at the past, although I refer to the history. The history must be remembered to make sure that we do not repeat the mistake of the past. But whatever the history is, let that go into history. And let's now have a new organization, realistic, equitable, that makes for the future hope, certainty, and development of global South.
Thank you, sir. President Larry, I come to you because the premise of Atlantic Dialogues is intercontinental, intergenerational dialogue. So if you were to put some flesh to this new Atlantic Cooperation Organization that President Obasanjo has just suggested, what would it look like, setting aside what is obvious to us, that Russia and China seem to be replacing Western and Northern influence in both the African and Latin American continents?
Well, Latin America has been very prolific in creating integration organizations. And the results have been really limited, very modest, and very often irrelevant. I think that the problem in our countries is not so much in creating organizations for integration, which are already there. They are there. But in having each country complying with their obligations, their responsibilities, and organizing the economy, putting it in practice, creating jobs, reducing poverty, and improving life conditions. And this is our task, which for a long time the Third World discourse attributed to the developed world. The problems in our regions, Africa, Latin America, Asia, were problems caused mainly by the US and their imperialist thinking. The same could be said about China today, or, for that matter, it could have been said for the Soviet Union. I do not think that this discourse corresponds to this new 21st century sphere. I said that Africa is an important interlocutor in international politics than when it was in the 20th century. I regretted that Latin America has lost the power it used to have in this international agreement, and that today, very often, they are irrelevant. All this to conclude that we, and only we, the countries, the formerly known non-aligned countries, or the third world countries, if I may, we need to comply with our tasks and obligations. And under these conditions, in our compliance of the international world's rules, we need to seek the best means available for our relationships, and not only with the US, but also with China. It is the second world's largest economy. I said it before, and let me say it again. Thanks to the exports to China and to their magnificent growth, Latin American countries are developing, and this is going to increase in future.
I feel the need to challenge you, President Osvaldo, because what I'm hearing is that your worldview, your determination of where we are within the Atlantic Basin is that we must deal with things as they are at the moment, whereas we have opportunities. President Obasanjo has suggested, what cooperation might look like. We have researchers working on the opportunities, what a policy response to the opportunities available might look like within the Atlantic. And so are you able to envision a Latin America that is able to assert itself and negotiate?
And it's still happening in the 21st century, has put an end to the belief that there is another economic model. In fact, the Chinese miracle is based on a capitalist economic regime, and the same goes to Vietnam. And those countries that persevered in their statistic systems with a centrally planned economy and with a model for redistributing wealth have failed. In Cuba, all Cubans are poor. In Venezuela, 9 out of 10 Venezuelans are poor. 7 million Venezuelans have fled the country. They migrated, escaping poverty. And one of the dramas in Latin America is exactly that, believing that the market economy impoverishes people, that it backs people off, that it makes it impossible for the poor to develop themselves. And that is not true. Latin America today, well, poverty only affects 29% of the population. We're no longer talking about 50, 60 or 70% as before. I am aware that much of what I'm saying is not politically correct, but I believe that the facts that happened in the 21st century do demonstrate what I'm saying. Let me just give you another example from Latin America. Chile. Chile was just on the verge of becoming a developed country, up until the moment where there was a social movement that rose with many terrorist elements in it, and it halted the Chileans' development, and they missed the opportunity to become a developed country. Well, let me go back to the former point. As far as Latin America and Africa failed to comply with their duties and do not have the reality of today's world very present, and insofar as they do not assume the experiences from the last part of the 20th century and the 21st century, we will not be able to move, we will not be able to make any progress, and will not become interlocutor with influence in the international sphere, even among the Pacific countries and also the countries along the Atlantic basin.
Sir, President Obasanjo, I'll come to you before I go to the audience for some questions, because President Laria paints a fairly grim picture of Latin America's development, and he talks about the poverty. And for us in Africa, our grim reality is conflict. You yourself are the African Union High Envoy for the Horn of Africa, which unfortunately is always on fire. And so you've given us this optimistic view of what a new Atlantic deal could look like. But is that possible with a continent that is constantly at war with itself?
Well, I understand where President Laria is coming from. And the situation he painted for Latin America is not really markedly different from the situation in Africa. And if I can go to underline my understanding of his position, it is the position we are in Latin America and in Africa that I believe demands that we should have collaboration, cooperation, and togetherness. We in Africa, within the last 4 years or so, we came up with African Continental Free Trade Agreement, which will make Africa one market, probably the largest market in the world. And we believe that this is very, very necessary for us. It will help to build togetherness economically. It will help to ward off undesirable and unnecessary intervention in our affairs, at least economically. And if that will help Africa, I believe Africa and Latin America and the Caribbean coming together in a cooperative or a cooperation organization should be of a great help. I understand the point that President Laria is making about the other part of the world and their influence in Africa or in Latin America. Yes, we do not mind any country or group of countries coming to do legitimate economic transaction with us. What I believe we must not allow to continue to happen is to exploit or subject ourselves to exploitation in whatever form or guise. And that we will be able to do better if we are working together and not working in silos. His point about taking care of our individual countries, I do agree with. But that even you will not be able to do adequately and well unless you have cooperation and collaboration at the sub-regional level, at the regional level, continental level, and we are now saying at the South Atlantic level. And I don't see why that should not be the way out, because it will be better for us, it will be better for the world, and it will be better for those who want to genuinely trade or have economic interaction with us. For instance, in Africa, instead of trading with 54, 55 countries, you will have one market. So you will not have to go through 54 regulations, 54 rules. And if we can have the collaboration and the cooperation that we are suggesting for Latin America, Caribbean, and Africa, well, I believe it will be the way that we will be able to take care of equity, progress in our development, progress in our economic relationship, and maybe help us also to ward off conflict and insecurity within our countries, within our sub-region, within our continent, and within the cooperation of South Atlantic.
Thank you, sir. Wow. I haven't even asked you to put your hands up yet, but to put your hands up. And because I have line of sight here, my democracy tends to work from one end of the room to the other, but I have line of sight to this side of the room. So if we could start with this section, please be as short, please be as concise as possible. State your name and ask your questions. We'll try and take 3 at a time, and then bearing in mind that we have translation as well. Please be as clear as possible if you're asking your questions in English. And so we have questions on this front row. Yes.
Thank you so very, very much for a very interesting conversation this afternoon. My name is Len Ishmael. Just very quickly, just to set the record straight, I think that we can't speak about Cuba and Cuba having failed without another piece of the equation, which is a 70-year-old or more blockade of the country. And despite that, Cuba has been a development partner for all of the Eastern Caribbean countries and the wider Caribbean countries as well, and we take quite a lot of pride in that association. Second quick thing, I think that it's unfair to say as well, perhaps, or maybe historically not correct to say that there haven't been quite a lot by way of alliances across the Southern Atlantic. If we even go back to the days of apartheid and the beginning of civil rights movement in the United States, the very seat of that was Latin America, the Caribbean, and the African diaspora in the United States and the UK. So we found each other when we needed to. Somewhere along the line, we lost that, but we need to find that again. Very, very quick observations as well. One is that we do have the Georgetown Agreement, which has pulled together the African, Caribbean, and Pacific group of countries, 79 member states that stand for something for the last 30, 40 years, and there is a revised Treaty of Georgetown as well that very much deals with this relationship among and between us. We have the community called CELAC, which is Latin America and the Caribbean, in that relationship with the EU as well. And then you fast forward, you take a look at what's happening in the BRICS, and we have agency. We've got Brazil, we've got South Africa, we've got countries that are now middle powers that have ceded multipolarity across the world and providing greater choice for countries of the global South. We no longer speak about the global South, we speak about a new sense, a new South.
Y cuando hablamos del sur global, hablamos de un nuevo sur. Y, señor presidente, el año pasado hubo una gran cumbre en Little Bridgetown y por primera vez Etiopía trajo a más de 800 líderes africanos al Caribe y habló de cooperación entre regiones. El mayor banco de exportaciones de África ha establecido un acuerdo en todos y cada uno de los países del Caribe. Y la segunda cumbre va a tener lugar en Ghana. Acabamos de hablar no solamente de los intercambios de todo tipo, sino acuerdos a cielo abierto, etcétera, que ya hemos mencionado antes. También hablamos.
OPEC-type cartels.
Sorry, thank you. The point is made, and I thank you for adding that
Yes.
to the record.
Okay.
I'd love to give other people a chance to interact with the former presidents. So since, please, if you don't have a question, which it doesn't sound like there is, pass the microphone on.
Yes, no, I'm happy to do that. I just wanted to make the point that it is optimistic. There's reason for hope.
Thank you so much for throwing that in. Yes, go ahead. Yes.
Two quick questions. One, do you think that the challenge we have is that we have demonized the role of governments, and somehow governments have become the enemies of people, in the sense that there is no trust between the people and their governments? That's the issue number one. And second, the way we have designed our democracies, do you think that we have planted in them the major elements of instability that we see happening?
Okay. Laundry, behind you.
Hello, Laundry. Thank you, Excellencies, Madam Chair. You have presented a brilliant perspective, a southern perspective on the broader Atlantic. Would you mind elaborating on the southern perspective about the West? So, and not just about the South. So how will the South be also shaping, collaborating, and shaping how the West will engage in the broader Atlantic basin? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. There's a question right in the front here. I will come to you. I will come to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm Hafiz Ghanem. I'm from Egypt and working also with the Policy Center here. Very happy to see you again, President Obasanjo. It's a great pleasure to be here with you. And what I would like to do is follow up on Udwak's question to you on what's happening in Africa. I mean, we look around the continent now and we see a lot of conflict. I'm seeing what's happening in Sudan, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We saw all of the coups d'etats in Niger, in Guinea, in what's happening in Mali. And things seem to be getting worse inside Africa. So when we want to talk about togetherness, shouldn't we try to understand what's happening inside Africa and how can we make things better there?
Okay, great. Excellencies, I will ask you to respond to these questions in totality.
Before you do, could you just let me make one point about what President Obasanjo said, and I, with due respect, disagree with him about the formation of new organizations to try to solve problems that the old organizations have been unable to solve. We saw what happened with Niger and ECOWAS. We've seen what's happening in Latin America with the OAS, where Venezuela and Nicaragua have left the organization. Latin America, as President Hurtado said, is one of the countries where we have the most organizations we've created in our lifetime, most of which don't work. So remember that organizations, multilateral organizations, only work as well as the component membership allows them to work.
Thank you. Sorry, we will answer this set of questions first and then come back for more questions. I will ask you, Excellencies, in spite of your vast experience and wisdom, to be as brief as we can so that more people can ask you questions. Okay? And so I think President Obasanjo, there were several directed at you, and then President Larry, there were some directed at you as well. Is that all right? Okay.
Thank you very much. I believe the first point you made is government now the enemy of the people? And if so, is democracy working as we want it to work? I think that's more or less what you said. Let me take democracy first. I think one of the American presidents defined democracy as government of the people, for the people, by the people. But from representative democracy, democracy seems to be government of the people, by the people, for the people. I believe what that American president was defining was the democracy that worked in Athens in the Greek days, when people were gathered in the square and they took decisions. But liberal democracy, as is practiced today, is representative. And when you have only 50% of a population of a country registering to vote, and only 25% of those registered to vote voted, and 51% of those who voted decided who rules the country. Is that government of the people, by the people, for the people? Obviously, no. So we have to rethink democracy in a way that it will serve the people and it will represent the interest of the people. And if we do that, I believe we may be getting to a situation where government will not be regarded as the enemy of the people, but rather as the friend of the people. That is the situation in many African countries. I know I can talk about authoritatively about Africa. A situation where elections are openly rigged and the electoral authority are compromised, the court is compromised, and the population knows this, and they have no respect for the government that comes out of that type of process. It's a problem. And it's a problem that we have to find solution.
President Obasanjo.
Now, let me just finish. Then I bring that to the question about Africa. The conflict in Africa, for instance, the existing of government that have come out of coups, I believe 4 of them in Africa today came directly from so-called democracy, elections. Gabon came out of election. Guinea-Conakry came out of election. Even Mali came out of election. Burkina Faso came out of election. So we can see the problem of democracy going into a new form of order, or if you like, disorder in Africa. So I would say that we have to rethink democracy in such a way that government becomes a friend of the people, and people see the government as their own government, in which they have stake and in which they believe, and the one that they respect. Most of our government in Africa are not respected by their own people. That is the truth.
Okay. We have 18 minutes
Yeah,
to go.
okay. Yes, I still have 2 points that I haven't covered.
Okay.
But you either allow me to cover them but I can cover them quickly.
Okay.
New organization that we talk about, that I'm talking about, is not an organization to go to war. It's not an organization to settle conflict. It's an organization for economic and development purpose. Economic and development purpose. Now, if you do not think that we need an organization like that, where I say you need to work together, then we have to rethink.
Thank you, sir. You forgive me because we have elders here, and I'm trying to get as many questions
Yes,
as
I will be
possible.
very brief.
Right.
I would like to have 2 questions. First one to President Obasanjo. He always comes with the very interesting and innovative ideas. I recall, I participated in a panel with you in the Munich Security Conference on Migration, I think you remember, a few years ago. And you came with this idea of working together, Europe and Africa, on migration. The second was in a different place, in Africa, in Botswana, in the Kalahari Desert, when we were talking about the region. Now, today, I think you came also with a new idea to create an organization at the level of the Atlantic state to face the challenges. Good idea. But the question for you is how you realize the coherence between what this proposal and what we are doing at the level of the African Union. One. Segunda pregunta para usted, señor presidente.
And the second question for you, Mr. President. You talked about the cooperation between Latin America and Africa. This is normal, it's essential. But today, there is no platform that allows us to work together since both continents must face the same challenges. And therefore, how do you imagine a future cooperation between Africa and Latin America? Thank you.
Was brief, huh?
You're okay. There's some questions on this side. Oh, Vemba, right behind you. Okay.
I'm Vemba Pezo Dizolele, CSIS, Washington, D.C. Question is actually to President Obasanjo. So, Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement is very aspirational. Hopefully, Africa gets there. Today, we're not there. Today, we are in a very dislocated place. ECOWAS, which you were chairman of, used to work pretty well. It's not delivering anymore. The other RECs, ECAS, and others, SADC, are not really delivering. What are the obstacles that the continent is facing within those organizations? If we're talking about more assertive Atlantic today, there's no way we're going to get there with as formidable competitors as Europe and China if Africa is dislocated the way it is. Thank you.
Okay. And you've got a question right there? Yes, give it to him. You're standing right next to him. Yes.
Hi, my name is Amit. I'm the director of the NTU SPF Center for African Studies based in Singapore. So as someone who's located in Asia, I have the advantage of looking at this Atlantic deal a little bit more dispassionately, perhaps, as many of you folks here. One is a deal can be made provided you recognize that there are dependencies. The very fact that both Latin America and Africa are resource dependent, are dependent on the global north for finance, they face the same kind of problems. The complementarity doesn't exist. So if there's one lesson perhaps, and this I can put to both the leaders here, is in the case of Asia, they were able to create those dependency before they were able to assert themselves. What kind of complementarities would the two continents in the Atlantic be able to create before they start to asserting themselves for a new deal?
Hi, Gustavo de Carvalho from South African Institute of International Affairs. It's more of a comment, and I'll try to be as brief as I can. I think there is still a lot of very low-hanging fruits if we want to talk about an interaction between the Atlantic, the South Atlantic, between Africa and South America. One of them is that all of us that live in Africa or go to South America, how difficult it is to travel between the two regions. You often have to go to the Middle East, you often have to go to Europe, and I've even seen people going to North America before they cross the Atlantic. I mean, if we were to put between Natal and Senegal, closest point between the Americas, 2,800 kilometers, around 3 to 4 hours flight, Lisbon to Athens, you would still have to probably go to Europe or the Middle East if you want to cross that. I think the second issue, and I think there is potentially an opportunity for the two regions. I know leaders in South America have been working very hard, probably failing with this free trade area between the European Union and Mercosur. There is an important space, I think, to look into how our trade blocks in the two regions, both in terms of the African continental free trade areas, the regional economic communities, and those aspects within the continent, they can be enhanced. Third, when it comes to defense, we talk about South America, and I'll close now. I think there is still in two regions that do not look into one another when we're talking about security, and that has a lot to do with very important challenges that we have in terms of transnational crime, in terms of drugs. We know that a lot of the drugs that route towards Europe tend to stop in countries like Guinea-Bissau, coming from South America, and there's still very limited issues. So I think we need to deal with those low-hanging fruits before we talk about a robust Atlantic cooperation. There is still a lot that can be done that could make it less robust, but still very important for the two regions.
And we jump response to his question. So President Larry, I'll come to you. There are a couple of issues for you. Because we're running out of time, we will end with this round of questions. So in responding to the questions, I will ask you to also make your final thoughts. Is that okay? That's the best we can do, given the context. Thank you. Please go ahead.
Well, I would like to mention three things from the Latin American perspective. The Latin American continent has a long background of projects, agreements, and integration treaties. And intra-regional commerce is irrelevant. After more than half a century, when did intra-regional commerce started to improve? Well, when free trade agreements were entered into. And these agreements have been and are being absolutely fundamental for the development of Latin America, and also I believe that goes to Africa as well. I cited the example from Mexico. They said that they were far from God and near the US, and that was presented as a curse. I think it was very beneficial for Mexico to be the US's neighbors. It doesn't matter if they were far from God. So I believe that in future, free trade, both for Latin America and for Africa will be fundamental for their progress. And obviously, who do Africans and Latin Americans have to have free trade agreements in place with? Well, with the US, with China, with Europe. The second issue is that of democracy. Well, yes, democracy is in crisis. It is a system that has many flaws. But as that great British statistician, Winston Churchill, just said it half a century ago, the democracy is the worst government system with the exception of all the others. No better governance system has been created yet, not only to ensure freedoms and rights and the participation of the citizens, but also for the progress of nations. China is an exception. All the remaining countries that were able to develop and make progress in the last decades of the 20th century and the 21st century were under democratic regimes. And the third issue is that of the inequalities. The media, the discourse from political leaders, the manifestos from social organizations and the discourse from the youth always highlight the inequalities that exist. In the case of Latin America, inequalities have worsened. It is the most unequal continent in the world. And yet, I believe that in the state of the development of Africa and Latin America, the question of inequalities is secondary. The fundamental issue is reducing poverty and the construction of a middle class. Inequalities, on the other hand, I believe that in this world of the digital era is not possible. When we have youth of 20 or 30 years of age who are billionaires and who did not have 2 pennies to rub together, but thanks to their talent, they now have billions of dollars in their accounts. When we have footballers who have heritage nearing $2 billion, such as Messi or Le Monde from the US Basketball League. And when we have artists whose wealth is well over $1 billion, such as, for instance, this singer, what's her name? Is it Taylor Swift? Inequalities, well, how to overcome those inequalities with such phenomena? These issues I just pointed out should lead us to put a special focus on reducing poverty, and this requires job creation, and this requires growing the economy. And therefore, from this perspective, we should look at economic growth not just as a successful economic policy, but as a social policy. Because insofar as there is economic growth, there will be more employment and poverty will go down. And someone with a job can feed their family, they can educate their family, they can heal and treat their family, they can enjoy with their family, they can buy clothes for their family without any help from the state. Then you have education policies, health policies, and what have you. But the education and health policies in their own right cannot reduce poverty. The only thing that reduces poverty is employment, having a job. Thank you.
President of
Thank you very much. Let me quickly deal with the issue. Somebody raised the point. If we have the South Atlantic Cooperation Organization or Atlantic Cooperation Organization, what of the engagement with the West? On the economic side, on trade side, I believe the engagement with the West, with China, or with any other group of nations, for that matter, will be easier. I have no doubt about that. Then the point I was made, there are existing organizations that have not been able to deal with existing issues, conflicts, and so on. My answer to that is, if with these existing organizations things were this bad, how would they have been without these organizations? Then I go to the point made, what should be the difference between what the new organization will be doing and what AU will be, or what AU is doing? There's no conflict. What AU is doing, AU will continue to do. And AU and the Latin America organizations will work closer together. And what that will mean is that if we are talking of 1.3 billion population market in Africa, when we add Latin America and the Caribbean to it, we will be talking of 2 billion. And I think that is good for any part of the world that wants to trade or carry out economic transaction. Complementarity. I believe that within each organization, the AU, the Latin America organization, whatever they have to do to put their house in order, this new organization doesn't stop in its way. And of course, they should continue to put their own house in order to help the new organization in the way it should go. And I don't believe that they necessarily have to have a perfect organization before coming together on the Atlantic Cooperation Organization. Low-hanging fruit. I do agree that whatever can be taken as low-hanging fruit must be taken, because nothing succeeds like success. And anything that you can point at as, look, this is what is success from this, it will encourage more success. My closing point is that we must never be tired of organizations, especially when we talk of subsidiarity. There will be what we can do at the national level. There will be what is better done at the regional level. There will be what we need to do at the local continental level or subcontinental level. Each of them must be given its proper place. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of this session. I want to thank you for your time, but I'd like us also to share some, show our appreciation to our elders from Africa and Latin America, President Laria from Ecuador, and former President Obasanjo from Nigeria. Thank you so much for your time, your wisdom, your insights. Thank you. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we invite you to a coffee break.
The Policy Center for the New South is organizing the 12th edition of the Atlantic Dialogues Conference, its annual high-level gathering of influential public and private sector leaders from around the Atlantic Basin for open, candid, and informal discussions on cross-regional and cross-sectoral issues. Over 350 high-level participants will gather from more than 70 countries to delve into this year's theme, A More Assertive Atlantic, its meaning for the world. Same as every edition, the conference will allow for different session formats. Over 10 plenary sessions and 3 AD talks will be on the record, available for streaming on the Policy Center's website. 2 night owl sessions and over 15 thematic breakout dinners will be held in more intimate settings around the city of Maryland.